when it comes to academic pay dirt, scruples and practicalities can sometimes be a little bit at odds, which is to say, I'm deaf and old enough to be a retired teacher, but I'm still a community college student because it was only late in life, a life of being a dishwasher and so on, that someone taught me sign language and I went back to school. But one of the things I've learned from academics is that with every research question, there's a thrill of victory and an agony of defeat. Sometimes a happy medium where you gain some insight. My scruples tell me to wait and prepare, go over my copious notes. Practical considerations have taught me, however, that sometimes going with the muse, it has been a long and tiring day, can have certain benefits that are unexpected. I believe it was Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead who, after a poor performance, was questioned, how does it feel to turn out such a um, below average show? And he said, it's always wonderful to have my friends around me when I'm feeling down, which is to say, I'm going to do my best to cover the ground, but there was a lot of territory and some things could fall by the wayside. I'll get back to this. But I want to pick up at the research question I brought to the intelligence of Seattle University because it led to quite a bit of reshuffling of my thoughts on the subject of why Camila Valieva fell at the Beijing 2022 Olympics, arriving in fourth place, which has been a very productive question. It might seem strange that I ask myself questions that focus me, which might seem to be inane questions. Today's long meditation arrives at a similar question. Not why did Valieva fall? That's where I arrived at last time. But is Cubism to blame for the lack of ecology in our society and our political system internationally? You may remember from a previous talk I gave that I asked if D.W. Griffith crossed paths with Ouspensky. I expected to be, and still expect it to be, a productive line of inquiry. It's one I took up with Seattle University today, and I'll get to the results. But I'd like to explain why it's an important question and what the ramifications are for public education. Because we need, in public education, a steering committee towards relevance. D.W. Griffith was a movie director who asserted the epic power of Hollywood at its very birth. He created a film called The Birth of the Nation that glorified the rise of the KKK. After the Civil War, the defeated reasserted their power, and it wasn't just through economic relations between U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh and Birmingham Steel in Alabama, but it was through ideological fixates about racism, and the birth of the nation fed that like no other machine. Around this time, and I was exploring this because I saw the arc of 100 years, or the life of Paul Robeson, at least 50 years, half a century, to the end of World War II, when the same gang, the gang who had created the first use of the Burning Cross for the KKK, were making Ronald Reagan's wartime films, in which I discovered pro-Axis semiotics. The defeated reasserted their power after World War II through the same instrument and the same gang. Interesting enough on its own terms. But it gets more interesting when you discover that they created a super story, a Texas school book. Hollywood swooped down and murdered JFK and created a Texas school book. We found the script, which gives keys into the semiotics that are involved in a superstructure in the background of all of these Axis Hollywood movies that tell the story of Hitler's escape, of a war game called Two Virgins that was clocked to genocide pornography that encrypts abortion as a function of Auschwitz. Where did that come from? I mean, I have it here. I have it in hundreds of um, prints from many, many dozens of films with the same background story, a super story told in the background. It doesn't come out. It's in Casablanca. It's in Guns of Navarone. It's in Japanese films made by Kurosawa. It's in Ozu films. It's in German films made by Wolfgang Stout. Wolfgang Stout, The Murderers Among Us, is what tipped me off. I came across it, somebody highlighted it almost as if to get my attention in Seattle Public Library one day, many decades ago. And I've been on this ever since. Some of these films actually slayed out the entire panorama and explanation for the murder of JFK, which was revenge for Hiroshima. My father was on a ship off the coast of northern Japan, so I was deafened by the very enterprising Axis um, inside circle. But where did it come from? What does this mean? Why did Khalifa Valieva fall at Beijing 2022 into fourth place? Aha. Fourth way. The fourth dimension. My father came from public schools. He built them. He wrote Humanizing the School, Foundations of Modern Education. He believed in public education. He turned down the presidency of the University of Georgia when they refused to desegregate. He was committed to human rights and civil rights. He was called a hero by the director of the Northeast chapter of Amnesty International who studied with him. He was a leader of an African Peace Corps chapter. He was at Columbia Teachers College, acquainted personally with Eisenhower. Sank ship in the Navy as Bush. A distinguished, genial, fun-loving man who, in his retirement, drove a school bus. He was committed to public education. And when I was introduced by Robert Friedrich King Crimson to the Gurdjieff Society, I found a group of people who were openly hostile to public education. This was clandestine society, they told me. They would meet at the Synod in Pittsburgh. They had the attitude of Dr. Jordan Peterson, who comes now. I have friends in the climate change movement from Twitter. So, I mean, to me, it's just a way of keeping in touch with people I want to encourage. But he doesn't like Twitter. He says that it filters nothing, so that there's no limitations on who can learn what. There's no prior professional screening of people who ascend into knowledge. It's the habit of mind of an esoteric circle. At the time in the 1910s that Prokofiev, the musician who made Peter and the Wolf, had been working with Picasso, the Cubist. Picasso was doing his set design. Ouspensky was influential in this avant-garde society. He was from Moscow and Kharkiv, and he was a friend of Pierre Elliott and Gurdjieff. At least he was a friend of Gurdjieff, as was Pierre Elliott, who I met when Robert Fripp invited me to this Gurdjieff cloister. And in the 1910s, Cubists were, some of them, explaining their movement in terms of the fourth dimension. And I got a lot of material because from the Russian avant-garde of the times, because a fact checker got interested in the idea that they were influenced by Einstein. And the fact checker determined that it was before the special theory of relativity was written and published in 1916 and then proven in 1920. It was before then. So it wasn't, not that they weren't ready to embrace and contemplate Einstein's theory of relativity, but it wasn't based on the idea of the fourth dimension as time at all. It was a visual exploration of the fourth dimension. And Ouspensky was contemplating the noumena. The noumena, when I studied it in philosophy, was almost something the professor could say, no matter how you explained it, no, you're wrong. You don't understand. It's out of reach. But this fourth dimensional idea, this was in the age of Houdini, apparently gave rise to the inside circles that underwrite elites and lend mysticism to the great dictators inside circles. If you think about it, Picasso's lines came from African figures. If he had let that on, it would have taken a substantial amount of his claim to genius away from him. I know this because I've studied African maths with experts at the Community College of Allegheny County, which is part of Pennsylvania's Africana higher educational system. The debt to blacks, an unfathomable attribute of the noumena. But it's a very important factor in the way that the production key to the entertainment system locked the door. And the hostility that I found on, keep in mind that a lot of what we call power is the power to restrict access. And the hostility that I got from the Gurdjieff people was directed at public education, as a public education was not only inadequate to fathom the mysteries of Gurdjieff, but was presumptuous and invasive to even attempt to. When you look at the central question that I asked, is Cubism responsible for the lack of timely political action on the climate? What you see is, for one thing, let's look at the question. Many young people in 2022, I admire Vanessa Nakate of Makerere University in Uganda to no end. She works 24/7 on fathoming and understanding and trying to prevent the suffering of mass starvation. Okay, when you look at the hostility of these esoteric circles, you look at a couple of things simultaneously: their influence on culture and their lack of recognition in formal public education, which can be an obstacle on both sides. Like Aleister Crowley's influence over comic books, the mumbo jumbo of witchcraft comic books. It's just an entertainment thing. But it covers up that the Golden Dawn, the Knights of Infinite Resignation, and the Court of the Crimson King, Ouspensky Circle Sax Roamers, and the Fu Manchu guy harked into these tabula rosas, the Beatles and their obsession with codifying their rule in the Kennedy assassination, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, Ballad of Bungalow Bill, Rocky Raccoon, the various times that the release of the White Album on November 22nd, 1968, the way they set up Yoko Ono's invisible signature and claim on the entire heritage of the West that came when she signed a claim that Lennon died in this Houdini. Where does it come from? Ouspensky offered the fourth dimension to Prokofiev and Picasso. And Houdini was around, and it was adopted for this super story told by Hollywood. And there's always been some understanding that there's friction between Hollywood and public education. But to actually understand the depths and gravity of this friction has been elusive. You could talk about public education being boring and Hollywood being exciting and the way they prioritize the celebrities over the individual. You're supposed to succeed and rivals get ahead. Somebody always wins. This sort of thinking. But if you look back even at the age of the Cubists, Buckminster Fuller, Paul Robeson, they was around. Buckminster Fuller was a sort of a darling of the compassionate university system. He would speak at MIT and Carnegie Mellon University. I got to meet Linus Pauling and hear him talk, but I never had the privilege when it came to Buckminster Fuller. Although I met some of the people he influenced and who used him from Salk Research Labs for the AIDS attack that I investigated, the Two Virgins war game that was encrypted in the Hitler-Reagan cinemas. And I knew that one of the reasons why ecology was put on stall was because of the Rolling Stones wanting royalties. They were getting it from the Ouspensky lockdown on the production centers, the restrictions to access culture. But despite the fact that Buckminster Fuller sort of attributed resistance to him and his desire to push ecology to the arms race mentality and the warmongers, doesn't seem to have really understood what he was up against. And if he didn't understand what he was up against, how could the public schools? So although they loved him, they preserved things. I find books at Seattle Community College they don't know they have, but their scruples have caused them to preserve books about, for example, the Russian avant-garde, which confirms Ouspensky's fourth dimension influence over the Cubists. Now, when you look at these people, you don't only ask yourself what did they have against public education, but what are they doing that Buckminster Fuller didn't see? Buckminster Fuller was one of these people who just said, let's talk it out openly. The public can understand. He had faith in God, he had faith in people. He wanted to achieve a higher quality of life, minimum drain on the overall ecological system for everybody. He actually stated that the university was irrevocably, virtually implacably intent on making us all successful despite our overwhelming ignorance and fear. We're discovering that he was right, that cosmology, economics, ecology, and engineering are all the same thing. He called it synergy. So you ask yourself, what young people are asking themselves, drawing a blank, and they shouldn't be drawing a blank. It's why has there been such a lack of political activity to rescue our planet, political action for ecology? I think the root of this question lies in the Cubist centric, Cubism itself. The idea that came to dominate the hidden hand of media. It's the idea that cosmology and ecology are separate ideas. As a result, the lack of knowing the answer to that question, why has there been so little initiative politically to save our planet in the name of ecology? The lack of the answer, in fact, is part of the answer. If a cosmology is vying with the element of suspense so treasured by the ingenues of Hollywood, to say you must find the answer, they're playing like a riddle of the Sphinx, and they can substitute a counterfeit answer, and you would never know. They want you to, they want us to adopt their cosmology or no political action. Cosmology first is the game that they are playing. So, what's the answer? The answer was what Mr. Fuller was saying. Cosmology is ecology. They're not inseparable. But you have to know that this is what's been happening.